Book 4, Chapter 5 of the Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wars of the Jews by Josephus, translated by William Whiston. Chapter 5. The cruelty of the Idumeans when they were gotten into the temple during the storm, and of the Zealots, concerning the slaughter of Ananus and Jesus and Zacharias, and how the Idumeans retired home. This advice pleased the Idumeans, and they ascended through the city to the temple. The Zealots were also in great expectation of their coming, and earnestly waited for them. When therefore these were entering, they also came boldly out of the inner temple, and mixing themselves among the Idumeans, they attacked the guards. And some of those that were upon the watch, but were fallen asleep, they killed as they were asleep. But as those that were now awakened made a cry, the whole multitude arose, and in the amazement they were in caught hold of their arms immediately, and betook themselves to their own defence. And so long as they thought they were only the Zealots who attacked them, they went on boldly, as hoping to overpower them by their numbers. But when they saw others pressing in upon them also, they perceived the Idumeans were got in, and the greatest part of them laid aside their arms, together with their courage, and betook themselves to lamentations. But some few of the younger sort covered themselves with their armour, and valiantly received the Idumeans, and for a while protected the multitude of old men. Others indeed gave a signal to those that were in the city of the calamities they were in. But when these were also made sensible that the Idumeans were come in, none of them durst come to their assistance, only they returned the terrible echo of wailing, and lamented their misfortunes. A great howling of the women was excited also, and every one of the guards were in danger of being killed. The Zealots also joined in the shouts raised by the Idumeans, and the storm itself rendered the cry more terrible. Nor did the Idumeans spare anybody, for as they were naturally a most barbarous and bloody nation, and had been distressed by the tempest, they made use of their weapons against those that had shut the gates against them, and acted in the same manner as to those that supplicated for their lives, and to those that fought them, insomuch that they ran through those with their swords who desired them to remember the relation there was between them, and begged of them to have regard to their common temple. Now there was at present neither any place for flight, nor any hope of preservation, but as they were driven one upon another in heaps, so were they slain. Thus the greater part were driven together by force, as there was now no place of retirement, and the murderers were upon them, and having no other way, threw themselves down headlong into the city, whereby, in my opinion, they underwent a more miserable destruction than that which they avoided, because that was a voluntary one. And now the outer temple was all of it overflowed with blood, and that day, as it came on, they saw 8,500 dead bodies there. But the rage of the Idumeans was not satiated by these slaughters, but they now betook themselves to the city, and plundered every house, and slew every one they met. And for the other multitude, they esteemed it needless to go on with killing them, but they sought for the high priests, and the generality went with the greatest zeal against them. And as soon as they caught them, they slew them, and then standing upon their dead bodies, in way of jest, upbraided Ananus with his kindness to the people, and Jesus with his speech made to them from the wall, they proceeded to that degree of impiety as to cast away their dead bodies without burial, although the Jews used to take so much care of the burial of men, that they took down those that were condemned and crucified, and buried them before the going down of the sun. I should not mistake if I said that the death of Ananus was the beginning of the destruction of the city, and that from this very day may be dated the overthrow of her wall and the ruin of her affairs. whereon they saw their high priest, and the procurer of their preservation, slain in the midst of their city. He was on other accounts also a venerable and a very just man, and besides the grandeur of that nobility and dignity and honour of which he was possessed, he had been a lover of a kind of parity, even with regard to the meanest of the people. He was a prodigious lover of liberty, and an admirer of a democracy in government, and did ever prefer the public welfare before his own advantage, and preferred peace above all things, for he was thoroughly sensible that the Romans were not to be conquered. He also foresaw that of necessity a war would follow, and that unless the Jews made up matters with them very dexterously, they would be destroyed. To say all in a word, if Ananus had survived, they had certainly compounded matters, for he was a shrewd man in speaking and persuading the people, and had already gotten the mastery of those that opposed his designs, or were for the war. And the Jews had then put abundance of delays in the ways of the Romans, if they had had such a general as he was. Jesus was also joined with him, and although he was inferior to him upon the comparison, he was superior to the rest, and I cannot but think that it was because God had doomed this city to destruction, as a polluted city, and was resolved to purge his sanctuary by fire, that he cut off these their great defenders and well-wishers, while those that a little before had worn the sacred garments, and had presided over the public worship, and had been esteemed venerable by those that dwelt on the whole habitable earth, when they came into our city, were cast out naked, and seen to be the food of dogs and wild beasts. And I cannot but imagine that virtue itself groaned at these men's case, and lamented that she was here so terribly conquered by wickedness. And this at last was the end of Ananus and Jesus. Now after these were slain, the Zealots and the multitude of the Idumeans fell upon the people as upon a flock of profane animals, and cut their throats, and for the ordinary sort they were destroyed in what place soever they caught them. But for the noblemen and the youths, they first caught them and bound them, and shut them up in prison, and put off their slaughter, in hopes that some of them would turn over to their party. But not one of them would comply with their desires, but all of them preferred death before being enrolled among such wicked wretches as acted against their own country. But this refusal of theirs brought upon them terrible torments, for they were so scourged and tortured that their bodies were not able to sustain their torments, till at length and with difficulty they had the favour to be slain. Those whom they caught in the daytime were slain in the night, and then their bodies were carried out and thrown away, that there might be room for other prisoners. And the terror that was upon the people was so great that no one had courage enough either to weep openly for the dead man that was related to him, or to bury him, but those that were shut up in their own houses could only shed tears in secret, and durst not even groan without great caution, lest any of their enemies should hear them; for if they did, those that mourned for others soon underwent the same death with those whom they mourned for. Only in the night time they would take up a little dust, and throw it upon their bodies, and even some that were the most ready to expose themselves to danger would do it in the daytime, and there were 12,000 of the better sort who perished in this manner. And now these Zealots and Idumeans were quite weary of barely killing men, so they had the impudence of setting up fictitious tribunals and judicatures for that purpose. And as they intended to have Zacharias, the son of Baruch, one of the most eminent of the citizens, slain, so what provoked them against him was, that hatred of wickedness and love of liberty, which were so eminent in him. He was also a rich man, so that by taking him off, they did not only hope to seize his effects, but also to get rid of a small that had great power to destroy them. Some commentators are ready to suppose that this Zacharias the son of Baruch, here most unjustly slain by the Jews in the temple, was the very same person with Zacharias the son of Barachias, whom our Saviour says the Jews slew between the temple and the altar. Matthew 23:35. This is a somewhat strange exposition, since Zechariah the prophet was really the son of Barachiah and grandson of Iddo, Zacharias 1:1, and how he died we have no other account than that before us in St. Matthew, while this Zacharias was the son of Baruch. Since the slaughter was past when our Saviour spake these words, the Jews had then already slain him, whereas this slaughter of Zacharias the son of Baruch in Josephus was then about 34 years future, and since the slaughter was between the temple and the altar, in the court of the priests, one of the most sacred and remote parts of the whole temple, while this was, in Josephus' own words, in the middle of the temple, and much the most probably in the court of Israel only, for ye have no intimation that the zealots had at this time profaned the court of the priests. Nor do I believe that our Josephus, who always insists on the peculiar sacredness of the inmost court and of the holy house that was in it, would have omitted so material an aggravation to this barbarous murder, as perpetrated in a place so very holy, had that been the true place of it. End of the footnote. So they called together by a public proclamation 70 of the principal men of the populace, for a show, as if they were real judges, while they had no proper authority. Before these was Zacharias accused of a design to betray their polity to the Romans, and having traitorously sent to Vespasian for that purpose. Now there appeared no proof or sign of what he was accused, but they affirmed themselves that they were well persuaded that so it was, and desired that such their affirmation might be taken for sufficient evidence. Now when Zacharias clearly saw that there was no way remaining for his escape from them, as having been treacherously called before them, and then put in prison, but not with any intention of a legal trial, he took great liberty of speech in that despair of his life he was under. Accordingly he stood up, and laughed at their pretended accusation, and in a few words confuted the crimes laid to his charge, after which he turned his speech to his accusers, and went over distinctly all their transgressions of the law, and made heavy lamentations upon the confusion they had brought public affairs to. In the meantime the zealots grew tumultuous, and had much ado to abstain from drawing their swords, although they designed to preserve the appearance and show of judicature to the end. They were also desirous on other accounts to try the judges, whether they would be mindful of what was just at their own peril. Now the 70 judges brought in their verdict that the person accused was not guilty, as choosing rather to die themselves with him than to have his death laid at their doors. Hereupon there arose a great clamour of the zealots upon his acquittal, and they all had indignation at the judges for not understanding that the authority that was given them was but in jest. So 2 of the boldest of them fell upon Zacharias in the middle of the temple and slew him. And as he fell down dead, they bantered him, and said, Thou hast also our verdict, and this will prove a more sure acquittal to thee than the other. They also threw him down from the temple immediately into the valley beneath it. Moreover, they struck the judges with the backs of their swords, by way of abuse, and thrust them out of the court of the temple, and spared their lives with no other design than that, when they were dispersed among the people in the city, they might become their messengers, to let them know they were no better than slaves. But by this time the Idumeans repented of their coming, and were displeased at what had been done, and when they were assembled together by one of the zealots, who had come privately to them, he declared to them what a number of wicked pranks they had themselves done in conjunction with those that invited them, and gave a particular account of what mischiefs had been done against their metropolis. He said that they had taken arms, as though the high priests were betraying their metropolis to the Romans, but had found no indication of any such treachery, but that they had succored those that had pretended to believe such a thing, while they did themselves the works of war and tyranny, after an insolent manner. It had been indeed their business to have hindered them from such their proceedings at the first, but seeing they had once been partners with them in shedding the blood of their own countrymen, it was high time to put a stop to such crimes, and not continue to afford any more assistance to such as are subverting the laws of their forefathers. For that if any had taken it ill that the gates had been shut against them, and they had not been permitted to come into the city, yet that those who had excluded them have been punished, and Ananus is dead, and that almost all those people had been destroyed in one night's time, that one may perceive many of themselves now repenting for what they had done, and might see the horrid barbarity of those that had invited them, and that they had no regard to such as had saved them, that they were so impudent as to perpetrate the vilest things under the eyes of those that had supported them, and that their wicked actions should be laid to the charge of the Idumeans, and would be so laid to their charge till somebody obstructs their proceedings, or separates himself from the same wicked action, that they therefore ought to retire home, since the imputation of treason appears to be a calumny, and that there was no expectation of the coming of the Romans at this time, and that the government of the city was secured by such walls as cannot easily be thrown down, and by avoiding any further fellowship with these bad men, to make some excuse for themselves, as to what they had been so far deluded, as to have been partners with them hitherto. End of Book 4, Chapter 5. Book 4, Chapter 6 of the Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wars of the Jews by Josephus, translated by William Whiston. Chapter 6. How the Zealots, when they were freed from the Idumeans, slew a great many more of the citizens, and how Vespasian dissuaded the Romans, when they were very earnest to march against the Jews, from proceeding in the war at that time. The Idumeans complied with these persuasions, and in the first place they set those that were in the prisons at liberty, being about 2,000 of the populace, who thereupon fled away immediately to Simon, one whom we shall speak of presently. After which these Idumeans retired from Jerusalem and went home, which departure of theirs was a great surprise to both parties, for the people, not knowing of their repentance, pulled up their courage for a while, as eased of so many of their enemies, while the zealots grew more insolent, not as deserted by their confederates, but as freed from such men as might hinder their designs, and put some stop to their wickedness. Accordingly they made no longer any delay, nor took any deliberation in their enormous practices, but made use of the shortest methods for all their executions, and what they had once resolved upon, they put in practice sooner than any one could imagine. But their thirst was chiefly after the blood of valiant men, and men of good families, the one sort of which they destroyed out of envy, the other out of fear, for they thought their whole security lay in leaving no potent men alive, on which account they slew Gorion, a person eminent in dignity, and on account of his family also. He was also for democracy, and of as great boldness and freedom of spirit as were any of the Jews whosoever. The principal thing that ruined him, added to his other advantages, was his free speaking. Nor did Niger of Peres escape their hands. He had been a man of great valor in their war with the Romans, but was now drawn through the middle of the city, and as he went he frequently cried out, and showed the scars of his wounds. And when he was drawn out of the gates, and despaired of his preservation, he besought them to grant him a burial. But as they had threatened him beforehand not to grant him any spot of earth for a grave, which he chiefly desired of them, so did they slay him, without permitting him to be buried. Now when they were slaying him, he made this imprecation upon them, that they might undergo both famine and pestilence in this war, and besides all that, they might come to the mutual slaughter of one another; all which imprecations God confirmed against these impious men, and was what came most justly upon them, when not long afterward they tasted of their own madness in their mutual seditions one against another. So when this Niger was killed, their fears of being overturned were diminished, and indeed there was no part of the people but they found out some pretence to destroy them, for some were therefore slain because they had had differences with some of them, and as to those that had not opposed them in times of peace, they watched seasonable opportunities to gain some accusation against them, and if any one did not come near them at all, he was under their suspicion as a proud man; if any one came with boldness, he was esteemed a contemner of them; and if any one came as aiming to oblige them, he was supposed to have some treacherous plot against them, while the only punishment of crimes, whether they were of the greatest or smallest sort, was death. Nor could any one escape unless he were very inconsiderable, either on account of the meanness of his birth or on account of his fortune. And now all the rest of the commanders of the Romans deemed this sedition among their enemies to be of great advantage to them, and were very earnest to march to the city, and they urged Vespasian, as their lord and general in all cases, to make haste, and said to him, that the providence of God is on our side, by setting our enemies at variance against each other; that still the change in such cases may be sudden, and the Jews may quickly be at one again, either because they may be tired out with their civil miseries, or repent them of such doings. But Vespasian replied that they were greatly mistaken in what they thought fit to be done, as those that, upon the theatre, love to make a show of their hands and of their weapons, but do it at their own hazard, without considering what was for their advantage and for their security; for that if they now go and attack the city immediately, they shall but occasion their enemies to unite together, and shall convert their force, now it is in its height, against themselves; but if they stay a while, they shall have fewer enemies, because they will be consumed in this sedition; that God acts as a general of the Romans better than he can do, and is giving the Jews up to them without any pains of their own, and granting their army a victory without any danger; that therefore it is their best way, while their enemies are destroying each other with their own hands, and falling into the greatest of misfortunes, which is that of sedition, to sit still as spectators of the dangers they run into, rather than to fight hand to hand with men that love murdering, and are mad one against another. But if any one imagines that the glory of victory, when it is gotten without fighting, will be more insipid, let him know this much, that the glorious success, quietly obtained, is more profitable than the dangers of a battle; for we ought to esteem these that do what is agreeable to temperance and prudence no less glorious than those that have gained great reputation by their actions in war; that he shall lead on his army with greater force when their enemies are diminished, and his own army refreshed after the continual labours they had undergone. However, that this is not a proper time to propose to ourselves the glory of victory; for that the Jews are not now employed in making of armour or building of walls, nor indeed in getting together auxiliaries, while the advantage will be on their side who give them such opportunity of delay, but that the Jews are vexed to pieces every day by their civil wars and dissensions, and are under greater misery than, if they were once taken, could be inflicted on them by us. Whether therefore any one has regard to what is for our safety, he ought to suffer these Jews to destroy one another, or whether he has regard to the greater glory of the action, we ought by no means to meddle with these men, now they are afflicted with a distemper at home. For should we now conquer them, it would be said the conquest was not owing to our bravery, but to their sedition. [Footnote: This prediction, that the city, Jerusalem, should then be taken and the sanctuary burned, by right of war, when a sedition should invade Jews, and their own hands should pollute the temple, or when any one should begin to slay his countrymen in the city, is wanting in our present copies of the Old Testament. But this prediction, as Josephus well remarks here, though, with the other predictions of the prophets, it was now laughed at by the seditious, was by their very means soon exactly fulfilled. However, I cannot but here take notice of Grotius' positive assertion upon Matthew 26:9, here quoted by Dr. Hudson, that it ought to be taken for granted, as a certain truth, that many predictions of the Jewish prophets were preserved, not in writing but by memory. Whereas it seems to me so far from certain that I think it has no evidence nor probability at all. End of the footnote. And now the commanders joined in their approbation of what Vespasian had said, and it was soon discovered how wise an opinion he had given. And indeed many there were of the Jews that deserted every day, and fled away from the zealots, although their flight was very difficult, since they had guarded every passage out of the city, and slew every one that was caught at them, as taking it for granted they were going over to the Romans. Yet did he who gave them money get clear off, while he only that gave them none was voted a traitor. So the upshot was this, that the rich purchased their flight by money, while none by the poor were slain. Along all the roads also vast numbers of dead bodies lay in heaps, and even many of those that were so zealous in deserting at length chose rather to perish within the city, for the hopes of burial made death in their own city appear of the two less terrible to them. But these zealots came at last to that degree of barbarity as not to bestow a burial either on those slain in the city or on those that lay along the roads, but as if they had made an agreement to cancel both the laws of their country and the laws of nature, and at the same time that they defiled men with their wicked actions, they would pollute the divinity itself also. They left the dead bodies to putrefy under the sun, and the same punishment was allotted to such as buried any as to those that deserted, which was no other than death, while he that granted the favour of a grave to another would presently stand in need of a grave himself. To say all in a word, no other gentle passion was so entirely lost among them as mercy, for what were the greatest objects of pity did most of all irritate these wretches, and they transferred their rage from the living to those that had been slain, and from the dead to the living. Nay, the terror was so very great, that he who survived called them that very first dead happy, as being at rest already, as did those that were under torture in the prisons declare that upon this comparison those that lay unburied were the happiest. These men therefore trampled upon all the laws of men and laughed at the laws of God, and for the oracles of the prophets they ridiculed them as the tricks of jugglers. Yet did these prophets foretell many things concerning the rewards of virtue and punishments of vice, which when these zealots violated, they occasioned the fulfilling of those very prophecies belonging to their own country. For there was a certain ancient oracle of those men, that the city should then be taken and the sanctuary burned by right of war, when a sedition should invade the Jews, and their own hand should pollute the temple of God. Now while these zealots did not quite disbelieve these predictions, they made themselves the instruments of their accomplishment. End of Book 4, Chapter 6. Book 6, Chapter 7 of the Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wars of the Jews by Josephus, translated by William Whiston. Chapter 7. How John tyrannized over the rest, and what mischiefs the Zealots did at Masada. How only Vespasian took Gadara, and what actions were performed by Placidus. By this time John was beginning to tyrannize, and thought it beneath him to accept of barely the same honours that others had, and joining to himself by degrees a party of the wickedest of them all, he broke off from the rest of the faction. This was brought about by his still disagreeing with the opinions of others, and giving out injunctions of his own in a very imperious manner, so that it was evident he was setting up a monarchical power. Now some submitted to him out of their fear of him, and others out of their good will to him, for he was a shrewd man to entice men to him, both by deluging them and putting cheats upon them. Nay, many there were that thought they should be safer themselves, if the causes of their past insolent actions should now be reduced to one head, and not to a great many. His activity was so great, and that both in action and in council, that he had not a few guards about him, yet was there a great party of his antagonists that left him, among whom envy at him weighed a great deal, while they thought it a very heavy thing to be in subjection to one that was formerly their equal. But the main reason that moved men against him was the dread of monarchy, for they could not hope easily to put an end to his power if he had once obtained it, and yet they knew that he would have his pretence always against them, that they had opposed him when he was first advanced, while every one chose rather to suffer anything whatsoever in war, than that, when they had been in a voluntary slavery for some time, they should afterward perish. So the sedition was divided into two parts, and John reigned in opposition to his adversaries over one of them. But for their leaders, they watched one another, nor did they at all, or at least very little, meddle with arms in their quarrels, but they fought earnestly against the people, and contended one with another which of them should bring home the greatest prey. But because the city had to struggle with three of the greatest misfortunes, war and tyranny and sedition, it appeared upon the comparison that the war was the less troublesome to the populace of them all. Accordingly they ran away from their own houses to foreigners, and obtained that preservation from the Romans which they despaired to obtain among their own people. And now a fourth misfortune arose, in order to bring our nation to destruction. There was a fortress of very great strength not far from Jerusalem, which had been built by our ancient kings, both as a repository for their effects in the hazards of war, and for the preservation of their bodies at the same time. It was called Masada. Those that were called Sicarii had taken possession of it formerly, but at this time they overran the neighbouring countries, aiming only to procure to themselves necessaries, for the fear they were then in prevented their further ravages. But when once they were informed that the Roman army lay still, and that the Jews were divided between sedition and tyranny, they boldly undertook greater matters, and at the feast of unleavened bread, which the Jews celebrate in memory of their deliverance from the Egyptian bondage, when they were sent back into the country of their forefathers, they came down by night, without being discovered by those that could have prevented them, and overran a certain small city called Engaddi. in which expedition they prevented those citizens that could have stopped them before they could arm themselves and fight them. They also dispersed them and cast them out of the city. As for such as could not run away, being women and children, they slew of them above 700. Afterward, when they had carried everything out of their houses, and had seized upon all the fruits that were in a flourishing condition, they brought them into Masada. And indeed these men laid all the villages that were about the fortress waste, and made the whole country desolate, while there came to them every day from all parts not a few men as corrupt as themselves. At that time all the other regions of Judea that had hitherto been at rest were in motion by means of the robbers. Now as it is in a human body, if the principal part be inflamed, all the members are subject to the same distemper. So by means of the sedition and disorder that was in the metropolis, had the wicked men that were in the country opportunity to ravage the same. Accordingly, when every one of them had plundered their own villages, they then retired into the desert. Yet were these men that now got together, and joined in the conspiracy by parties, too small for an army, and too many for a gang of thieves. And thus did they fall upon the holy places and the cities. [Footnote: By these hiera or holy places, as distinct from cities, must be meant prosoicheia or houses of prayer out of cities, of which we find mention made in the New Testament and other authors. See Luke 6:12, Acts 16:13, 16. They were situated sometimes by the sides of rivers, Acts 16:13, or by the seaside. So did the 72 interpreters go to pray every morning by the seaside before they went to their work. End of the footnote. Yet did it now so happen that they were sometimes very ill treated by those upon whom they fell with such violence, and were taken by them as men are taken in war; but still they prevented any further punishment as do robbers, who as soon as their ravages are discovered run their way. Nor was there now any part of Judea that was not in a miserable condition, as well as its most eminent city also. These things were told Vespasian by deserters. For although the seditious watched all the passages out of the city, and destroyed all, whosoever they were, that came thither, yet were there some that had concealed themselves, and when they had fled to the Romans, persuaded their general to come to their city's assistance, and save the remainder of the people, informing him withal that it was upon account of the people's good will to the Romans that many of them were already slain, and the survivors in danger of the same treatment. Vespasian did indeed already pity the calamities these men were in, and arose in appearance, as though he was going to besiege Jerusalem, but in reality to deliver them from a worse siege they were already under. However, he was obliged first to overthrow what remained elsewhere, and to leave nothing out of Jerusalem behind him that might interrupt him in that siege. Accordingly he marched against Gadara, the metropolis of Perea, which was a place of strength, and entered that city on the 4th day of the month Dystrus Adar. For the men of power had sent an embassage to him, without the knowledge of the seditious, to treat about a surrender, which they did out of the desire they had of peace, and for saving their effects, because many of the citizens of Gadara were rich men. This embassy the opposite party knew nothing of, but discovered it as Vespasian was approaching near the city. However, they despaired of keeping possession of the city, as being inferior in number to their enemies, who were within the city, and seeing the Romans very near to the city, so they resolved to fly, but thought it dishonourable to do it without shedding some blood, and revenging themselves on the authors of this surrender. So they seized upon Delesus, a person not only the first in rank and family in that city, but one that seemed the occasion of sending such an embassy, and slew him, and treated his dead body after a barbarous manner, so very violent was their anger at him, and then ran out to the city. And as now the Roman army was just upon them, the people of Gadara admitted Vespasian with joyful acclamations, and received from him the security of his right hand, as also a garrison of horsemen and footmen, to guard them against the excursions of the runagates. For as to their wall, they had pulled it down before the Romans desired them to do so, that they might thereby give them assurance that they were lovers of peace, and that if they had a mind they could not now make war against them. And now Vespasian sent Placidus against those that had fled from Gadara, with 500 horsemen and 3,000 footmen, while he returned himself to Caesarea with the rest of the army. But as soon as these fugitives saw the horsemen that pursued them just upon their backs, and before they came to a close fight, they ran together to a certain village, which was called Besennabris, where finding a great multitude of young men, and arming them, partly by their own consent, partly by force, they rashly and suddenly assaulted Placidus and the troops that were with him. These horsemen at the first onset gave way a little, as contriving to entice them further off the wall, and when they had drawn them into a place fit for their purpose, they made their horse encompass them round, and threw their darts at them. So the horsemen cut off the flight of the fugitives, while the foot terribly destroyed those that fought against them. For those Jews did no more than show their courage, and then were destroyed. For as they fell upon the Romans when they were joined close together, and as it were walled about with their entire armour, they were not able to find any place where the darts could enter, nor were they any way able to break their ranks, while they were themselves run through by the Roman darts, and like the wildest of wild beasts rushed upon the point of others' swords. So some of them were destroyed, as cut with their enemies' swords upon their faces, and others were dispersed by the horsemen. Now Placidus' concern was to exclude them in their flight from getting into the village, and causing his horse to march continually on that side of them. He then turned short upon them, and at the same time his men made use of their darts, and easily took their aim at those that were the nearest to them, as they made those that were further off turn back by the terror they were in, till at last the most courageous of them brake through those horsemen and fled to the wall of the village. And now those that guarded the wall were in great doubt what to do, for they could not bear the thoughts of excluding those that came from Gadara, because of their own people that were among them, and yet if they should admit them, they expected to perish with them, which came to pass accordingly. For as they were crowding together at the wall, the Roman horsemen were just ready to fall in with them. However, the guards prevented them, and shut the gates, when Placidus made an assault upon them, and fighting courageously till it was dark, he got possession of the wall and of the people that were in the city, when the useless multitude were destroyed, but those that were more potent ran away, and the soldiers plundered the houses and set the village on fire. As for those that ran out of the village, they stirred up such as were in the country, and exaggerating their own calamities, and telling them that the whole army of the Romans were upon them, they put them in great fear on every side, so they got in great numbers together, and fled to Jericho, for they knew no other place that could afford them any hope of escaping, it being a city that had a strong wall and a great multitude of inhabitants. But Placidus, relying much upon his horsemen and his former good success, followed them, and slew all that he overtook, as far as Jordan. And when he had driven the whole multitude to the river side, where they were stopped by the current, for it had been augmented lately by rains, and was not fordable, he put his soldiers in array over against them. So the necessity the others were in provoked them to hazard a battle, because there was no place whither they could flee. They then extended themselves a very great way along the banks of the river, and sustained the darts that were thrown at them, as well as the attacks of the horsemen, who beat many of them, and pushed them into the current. at which fight, hand to hand, 15,000 of them were slain, while the number of those that were unwillingly forced to leap into Jordan was prodigious. There were besides 2,200 taken prisoners. A mighty prey was taken also, consisting of asses and sheep and camels and oxen. Now this destruction that fell upon the Jews, as it was not inferior to any of the rest in itself, so did it still appear greater than it really was, and this because not only the whole country through which they fled was filled with slaughter, and Jordan could not be passed over, by reason of the dead bodies that were in it, but because the lake Asphaltiris was also full of dead bodies that were carried down into it by the river. And now Placidus, after this good success that he had, fell violently upon the neighboring smaller cities and villages, when he took Abila and Julias and Bezemoth, and all those that lay as far as the lake Asphaltitis, and put such of the deserters into each of them as he thought proper. He then put his soldiers on board the ships, and slew such as had fled to the lake, insomuch that all Perea had either surrendered themselves or were taken by the Romans as far as Machaerus. End of Book 6, Chapter 7. Book 4, Chapter 8 of the Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wars of the Jews by Josephus, translated by William Whiston. Chapter 8. How Vespasian, upon hearing of some commotions in Gaul, made haste to finish the Jewish war. A description of Jericho and of the great plain, with an account besides of the lake Asphaltitis. In the meantime, an account came that there were commotions in Gaul, Greek Galatia, and so everywhere, and that Vindex, together with the men of power in that country, had revolted from Nero, which affair is more accurately described elsewhere. This report thus related to Vespasian excited him to go on briskly with the war, for he foresaw already the civil wars which were coming upon them, nay, that the very government was in danger, and he thought if he could first reduce the eastern parts of the empire to peace, he should make the fears of Italy the lighter, while therefore the winter was his hindrance from going into the field. He put garrisons into the villages and smaller cities for their security. He put decurions also into the villages, and centurions into the cities. He besides this rebuilt many of the cities that had been laid waste. But at the beginning of the spring he took the greatest part of his army, and led it from Caesarea to Antipatris, where he spent 2 days in settling the affairs of that city, and then on the 3rd day he marched on, laying waste and burning all the neighbouring villages. And when he laid waste all places about the topohry of Tamas, he passed on to Lydda and Jamnia, and when both these cities had come over to him, he placed a great many of those that had come over to him from other places as inhabitants therein, and then came to Emmaus, where he seized upon the passage which led thence to their metropolis, and fortified his camp, and leaving the 5th legion therein, he came to the toparchy of Betletophon. He then destroyed that place and the neighbouring places by fire, and fortified at proper places the strongholds all about Idumea. And when he had seized upon 2 villages, which were in the very midst of Idumea, Betaris and Caphartobas, he slew above 10,000 of the people, and carried into captivity above 1,000, and drove away the rest of the multitude, and placed no small part of his own forces in them, who overran and laid waste the whole mountainous country, while he, with the rest of his forces, returned to Emmaus, whence he came down through the country of Samaria, and hard by the city, by others called Neapolis or Sichem, but by the people of that country Marborta, to Corea, where he pitched his camp on the second day of the month Decius (Sivan), and on the day following he came to Jericho, on which day Trajan, one of his commanders, joined him with the forces he brought out of Perea, all the places beyond Jordan being subdued already. Hereupon a great multitude prevented their approach, and came out of Jericho, and fled to those mountainous parts that lay over against Jerusalem, while that part which was left behind was in a great measure destroyed. They also found the city desolate. It is situated in a plain, but a naked and barren mountain, of a very great length, hangs over it, which extends itself to the land about Scythopolis northward, but as far as the country of Sodom, and the utmost limits of the lake Asphaltites southward. This mountain is all of it very uneven and uninhabited, by reason of its barrenness. There is an opposite mountain that is situated over against it, on the other side of Jordan. This last begins at Julias and the northern quarters, and extends itself southward as far as Somorhon, which is the bounds of Petra in Arabia. [Footnote: Whether this Somorhon or Somorra ought not to be here written Gomorrah, as some manuscripts in a manner have it, for the place meant by Josephus seems to be near Segor or Zoar, at the very south of the Dead Sea, hard by which stood Sodom and Gomorrah, cannot now be certainly determined, but seems by no means improbable. End of the footnote. In this ridge of mountains there is one called the Iron Mountain, that runs in length as far as Moab. Now the region that lies in the middle between these ridges of mountains is called the Great Plain. It reaches from the village Ginnebris as far as the lake Asphaltites. Its length is 230 furlongs, and its breadth 120, and it is divided in the midst by Jordan. It has two lakes in it, that of Asphaltites and that of Tiberias, whose natures are opposite to each other, for the former is salt and unfruitful, but that of Tiberias is sweet and fruitful. This plain is much burnt up in summer time, and by reason of the extraordinary heat contains a very unwholesome air. It is all destitute of water, excepting the river Jordan, which water of Jordan is the occasion why those plantations of palm trees that are near its banks are more flourishing, and much more fruitful, as are those that are remote from it not so flourishing or fruitful. Notwithstanding which, there is a fountain by Jericho, that runs plentifully, and is very fit for watering the ground. It arises near the old city, which Joshua, the son of Naue, the general of the Hebrews, took the first of all the cities of the land of Canaan by right of war. The report is, that this fountain at the beginning caused not only the blasting of the earth and the trees, but of the children born of women, and that it was entirely of a sickly and corruptive nature to all things whatsoever, but that it was made gentle and very wholesome and fruitful by the prophet Elisha. This prophet was familiar with Eliah, and was his successor, who, when he once was the guest of the people at Jericho, and the men of the place had treated him very kindly, he both made them amends as well as the country by a lasting favor. For he went out of the city to this fountain, and threw into the current an earthen vessel full of salt, after which he stretched out his righteous hand unto heaven, and pouring out a mild drink offering, he made this supplication, that the current might be mollified, and that the veins of fresh water might be opened, that God also would bring into the place a more temperate and fertile air for the current, and would bestow upon the people of that country plenty of the fruits of the earth, and the succession of children, and that this prolific water might never fail them, while they continued to be righteous. To these prayers Elisha joined proper operations of his hands, after a skilful manner, and changed the fountain, and that water which had been the occasion of barrenness and famine before, from that time did supply a numerous posterity, and afforded great abundance to the country. [Footnote: This excellent prayer of Elisha is wanting in our copies, 2 Kings 2:21-22, though it be referred also in the apostolical constitutions, and the success of it is mentioned in them all. Accordingly the power of it is so great in watering the ground, that if it do but once touch a country, it affords a sweeter nourishment than other waters do, when they lie so long upon them, till they are satiated with them. For which reason the advantage gained from other waters, when they flow in great plenty, is but small, while that of this water is great when it flows even in little quantities. Accordingly it waters a larger space of ground than any other waters do, and passes along a plain of 70 furlongs long and 20 broad, wherein it affords nourishment to those most excellent gardens that are thick set with trees. There are in it many sorts of palm trees that are watered by it, different from each other in taste and name. The better sort of them, when they are pressed, yield an excellent kind of honey, not much inferior in sweetness to other honey. This country withal produces honey from bees. It also bears that balsam, which is the most precious of all the fruits in that place, cypress trees also, and those that bear myrobalanum, so that he who should pronounce this place to be divine would not be mistaken, wherein is such plenty of trees produced as are very rare, and of the most excellent sort. And indeed, if we speak of those other fruits, it will not be easy to light on any climate in the habitable earth that can be well compared to it. What is here sown comes up in such clusters, that cause of which seems me to be the warmth of the air, and the fertility of the waters, the warmth calling forth the sprouts and making them spread, and the moisture making every one of them take root firmly, and supplying that virtue which it stands in need of in summer time. Now this country is then so steadily burned up that nobody cares to come at it, and if the water be drawn up before sunrising, and after that exposed to the air, it becomes exceeding cold, and becomes of a nature quite contrary to the ambient air, as in winter again it becomes warm, and if you go into it, it appears very gentle. The ambient air is here also of so good a temperature that the people of the country are clothed in linen only, even when snow covers the rest of Judea. This place is 150 furlongs from Jerusalem, and 60 from Jordan. The country, as far as Jerusalem, is desert and stony, but that as far as Jordan and the lake Asphaltites lies lower indeed, though it be equally desert and barren. But so much shall suffice to have said about Jericho, and of the great happiness of its situation. The nature of the lake Asphaltites is also worth describing. It is, as I have said already, bitter and unfruitful. It is so light or thick that it bears up the heaviest things that are thrown into it, nor is it easy for any one to make things sink there into the bottom if he had a mind so to do. Accordingly, when Vespasian went to see it, he commanded that some who could not swim should have their hands tied behind them, and be thrown into the deep, when it so happened that they all swam as if a wind had forced them upwards. Moreover, the change of the colour of this lake is wonderful, for it changes its appearance thrice every day, and as the rays of the sun fall differently upon it, the light is variously reflected. However, it casts up black clouds of bitumen in many parts of it. These swim at the top of the water, and resemble both in shape and by bigness headless bulls. And when the labourers that belong to the lake come to it, and catch hold of it as it hangs together, they draw it into their ships, and when the ship is full, it is not easy to cut off the rest, for it is so tenacious as to make the ship hang upon its clods, till they set it loose with the menstrual blood of women and with urine, to which alone it yields. This bitumen is not only useful for the caulking of ships, but for the cure of men's bodies. It is mixed in a great many medicines. The length of this lake is 580 furlongs, where it is extended as far as Zoar in Arabia, and its breadth is 150. The country of Sodom borders upon it. It was of old a most happy land, both for the fruits it bore and the riches of its cities, although it be now all burnt up. It is related how, for the impiety of its inhabitants, it was burned by lightning, in consequence of which there are still the remainders of that divine fire, and the traces or shadows of the 5 cities are still to be seen, as well as the ashes growing in their fruits, which fruits have a colour as if they were fit to be eaten, but if you pluck them with your hands, they dissolve into smoke and ashes. And thus what is related of this land of Sodom has these marks of credibility, which our very sight affords us. End of Book 4, Chapter 8.
Book 4, Chapter 9 of the Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. The Wars of the Jews by Josephus, translated by William Whiston. Chapter 9. That Vespasian, after he had taken Gadara, made preparation for the siege of Jerusalem, but that, upon his hearing of the death of Nero, he changed his intentions, as also concerning Simon of Gyrus. 1. And now Vespasian had fortified all the places round about Jerusalem, and erected citadels at Jericho and Adida, and placed garrisons in them both, partly out of his own Romans, and partly out of the body of his auxiliaries. He also sent Lucius Annius to Gerasa, and delivered to him a body of horsemen, and a considerable number of footmen. So when he had taken the city, which he did at the first onset, he slew 1,000 of those young men who had not prevented him by flying away. But he took their families captive, and permitted his soldiers to plunder them of their effects, after he had set fire to their houses, and went away to the adjoining villages, while the men of power fled away, and the weaker part were destroyed, and what was remaining was all burnt down. And now the war having gone through all the mountainous country, and all the plain country also, those that were at Jerusalem were deprived of the liberty of going out of the city, for as to such as had a mind to desert, they were watched by the zealots, and as to such as were not yet on the side of the Romans, their army kept them in, by encompassing the city round about on all sides. 2. Now as Vespasian was returned to Caesarea, and was getting ready with all his army to march directly to Jerusalem, he was informed that Nero was dead, after he had reigned 13 years and 8 days. But as to any narration after what manner he abused his power in the government, and committed the management of affairs to those vile wretches, Nyphidius and Tigellinus, his unworthy freedmen, and how he had a plot laid against him by them, and was deserted by all his guards, and ran away with 4 of his most trusty freedmen, and slew himself in the suburbs of Rome, and how those that occasioned his death were in no long time brought themselves to punishment, how also the war in Gaul ended, and how Galba was made emperor and returned out of Spain to Rome, and how he was accused by the soldiers as a pusillanimous person, and slain by treachery in the middle of the marketplace at Rome, and Otho was made emperor, with his expedition against the commanders of Vitellius, and his destruction thereupon, and besides what troubles there were under Vitellius, and the fight that was about the Capitol, as also how Antonius Primus and Micianus slew Vitellius and his German legions, and thereby put an end to that civil war. I have omitted to give an exact account of them, because they are well known by all, and they are described by a great number of Greek and Roman authors. Yet for the sake of the connection of matters, and that my history may not be incoherent, I have just touched upon everything briefly. Footnote: of these Roman affairs and tumults under Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, here only touched upon by Josephus, see Tacitus, Suetonius, and Dio, more largely. However, we may observe with Otius that Josephus writes the name of the second of them not Otto, with many others, but Otho, with the coins. End footnote. Wherefore Vespasian put off at first his expedition against Jerusalem, and stood waiting whither the empire would be transferred after the death of Nero. Moreover, when he heard that Galba was made emperor, he attempted nothing till he also should send him some directions about the war. However, he sent his son Titus to him, to salute him, and to receive his commands about the Jews. Upon the very same errand did King Agrippa sail along with Titus to Galba. But as they were sailing in their long ships by the coast of Achaia, for it was winter time, they heard that Galba was slain, before they could get to him, after he had reigned 7 months and as many days. After whom Otho took the government, and undertook the management of public affairs. So Agrippa resolved to go on to Rome without any terror, on account of the change in the government. But Titus, by a divine impulse, sailed back from Greece to Syria, and came in great haste to Caesarea, to his father. And now they were both in suspense about the public affairs, the Roman Empire being then in a fluctuating condition, and did not go on with their expedition against the Jews, but thought that to make any attack upon foreigners was now unseasonable, on account of the solicitude they were in for their own country. 3. And now there arose another war at Jerusalem. There was a son of Giora, one Simon, by birth of Gerasa, a young man, not so cunning indeed as John of Gisehala, who had already seized upon the city, but superior in strength of body and courage, on which account, when he had been driven away from that Acrabattine toparchy, which he once had, by Ananus the high priest, he came to those robbers who had seized upon Mazda. At the first they suspected him, and only permitted him to come with the women he brought with him into the lower part of the fortress, while they dwelt in the upper part of it themselves. However, his manners so well agreed with theirs, and he seemed so trusty a man, that he went out with them, and ravaged and destroyed the country with them about Mazda. Yet when he persuaded them to undertake greater things, he could not prevail with them so to do, for as they were accustomed to dwell in that citadel, they were afraid of going far from that which was their hiding place. But he, affecting to tyrannize, and being fond of greatness, when he had heard of the death of Ananus, he left them, and went into the mountainous part of the country. So he proclaimed liberty to those in slavery, and a reward to those already free, and got together a set of wicked men from all quarters. 4. And as he had now a strong body of men about him, he overran the villages that lay in the mountainous country, and when there were still more and more that came to him, he ventured to go down into the lower parts of the country. And since he was now become formidable to the cities, many of the men of power were corrupted by him, so that his army was no longer composed of slaves and robbers, but a great many of the populace were obedient to him as to their king. He then overran the Acrabattine toparchy, and the places that reached as far as the great Idumea, for he built a wall at a certain village called Nain, and made use of that as a fortress for his own party's security. And at the valley called Paran, he enlarged many of the caves, and many others he found ready for his purpose. These he made use of as repositories for his treasures, and receptacles for his prey, and therein he laid up the fruits that he had got by rapine, and many of his partisans had their dwelling in them, and he made no secret of it that he was exercising his men beforehand, and making preparations for the assault of Jerusalem. 5. Whereupon the zealots, out of the dread they were in of his attacking them, and being willing to prevent one that was growing up to oppose them, went out against him with their weapons. Simon met them, and joining battle with them, slew a considerable number of them, and drove the rest before him into the city, but durst not trust so much upon his forces as to make an assault upon the walls. But he resolved first to subdue Idumea, and as he had now 20,000 armed men, he marched to the borders of their country. Hereupon the rulers of the Idumeans got together on the sudden the most warlike part of their people, about 25,000 in number, and permitted the rest to be a guard to their own country, by reason of the incursions that were made by the Sicarii that were at Mazda. Thus they received Simon at their borders, where they fought him, and continued the battle all that day. And the dispute lay whether they had conquered him, or been conquered by him. So he went back to Nain, as did the Idumeans return home. Nor was it long ere Simon came violently again upon their country, when he pitched his camp at a certain village called Thecoe, and sent Eleazar, one of his companions, to those that kept garrison at Herodium, and in order to persuade them to surrender that fortress to him. The garrison received this man readily, while they knew nothing of what he came about. But as soon as he talked of the surrender of the place, they fell upon him with their drawn swords, till he found that he had no place for flight, when he threw himself down from the wall into the valley below. So he died immediately. But the Idumeans, who were already much afraid of Simon's power, thought fit to take a view of the enemy's army before they hazarded a battle with them. 6. Now there was one of their commanders named Jacob, who offered to serve them readily upon that occasion, but had it in his mind to betray them. He went therefore from the village Aluris, wherein the army of the Idumeans were gotten together, and came to Simon, and at the very first he agreed to betray his country to him, and took assurances upon oath from him that he should always have him in esteem, and then promised him that he would assist him in subduing all Idumea under him. Upon which account he was feasted after an obliging manner by Simon, and elevated by his mighty promises. And when he was returned to his own men, he at first belied the army of Simon, and said it was manifold more in number than what it was. After which he dexterously persuaded the commanders, and by degrees the whole multitude, to receive Simon, and to surrender the whole government up to him without fighting. And as he was doing this, he invited Simon by his messengers, and promised him to disperse the Idumeans, which he performed also. For as soon as the army was nigh them, he first of all got upon his horse, and fled, together with those whom he had corrupted. Hereupon a terror fell upon the whole multitude, and before it came to a close fight, they broke their ranks, and every one retired to his own home. 7. Thus did Simon unexpectedly march into Idumea, without bloodshed, and made a sudden attack upon the city Hebron, and took it, wherein he got possession of a great deal of prey, and plundered it of a vast quantity of fruit. Now the people of the country say that it is an ancienter city, not only than any in that country, but than Memphis in Egypt, and accordingly its age is reckoned at 2,300 years. They also relate that it had been the habitation of Abram, the progenitor of the Jews, after he had removed out of Mesopotamia. And they say that his posterity descended from thence into Egypt, whose monuments are to this very time showed in that small city, the fabric of which monuments are the most excellent marble, and wrought after the most elegant manner. There is also there showed, at the distance of 6 furlongs from the city, a very large turpentine tree, and the report goes, that this tree has continued ever since the creation of the world. Footnote: some of the ancients call this famous tree, or grove, and oak others, a turpentine tree, or grove. It has been very famous in all the past ages, and is so, I suppose, at this day, and that particularly for an eminent mart or meeting of merchants there every year, as travelers inform us. End footnote. Thence did Simon make his progress over all Idumen, and did not only ravage the cities and villages, but lay waste to the whole country. For, besides those that were completely armed, he had 40,000 men that followed him, insomuch that he had not provisions enough to suffice such a multitude. Now, besides this want of provisions that he was in, he was of a barbarous disposition, and bore great anger at this nation, by which means it came to pass that Idumea was greatly depopulated, and as one may see all the woods behind despoiled of their leaves by locusts. After they had been there, so was there nothing left behind Simon's army but a desert. Some places they burnt down, some they utterly demolished, and whatsoever grew in the country, they either trod it down or fed upon it, and by their marches they made the ground that was cultivated harder and more untractable than that which was barren. In short, there was no sign remaining of those places that had been laid waste, that ever they had had a being. 8. This success of Simon excited the zealots afresh, and though they were afraid to fight him openly in a fair battle, yet did they lay ambushes in the passes, and seized upon his wife, with a considerable number of her attendants. Whereupon they came back to the city rejoicing, as if they had taken Simon himself captive, and were in present expectation that he would lay down his arms, and make supplication to them for his wife. But instead of indulging any merciful affection, he grew very angry at them for seizing his beloved wife. So he came to the wall of Jerusalem, and like wild beasts when they are wounded, and cannot overtake those that wounded them, he vented his spleen upon all persons that he met with. Accordingly, he caught all those that were come out of the city gates, either to gather herbs or sticks, who were unarmed and in years. He then tormented them and destroyed them, out of the immense rage he was in, and was almost ready to taste the very flesh of their dead bodies. He also cut off the hands of a great many, and sent them into the city to astonish his enemies, and in order to make the people fall into a sedition, and desert those that had been the authors of his wife's seizure. He also enjoined them to tell the people that Simon swore by the God of the universe, who sees all things, that unless they will restore him his wife, he will break down their wall, and inflict the like punishment upon all the citizens, without sparing any age, and without making any distinction between the guilty and the innocent. These threatenings so greatly affrighted, not the people only, but the zealots themselves also, that they sent his wife back to him, when he became a little milder, and left off his perpetual bloodshedding. 9. But now sedition and civil war prevailed, not only over Judea, but in Italy also. For now Galba was slain in the midst of the Roman marketplace. Then was Otho made emperor, and fought against Vitellius, who set up for emperor also, for the legions in Germany had chosen him. But when he gave battle to Valens and Caecina, who were Vitellius's generals, at Betriacum in Gaul, Otho gained the advantage of the first day, but on the second day Vitellius's soldiers had the victory, and after much slaughter Otho slew himself, when he had heard of this defeat at Brixia, after he had managed the public affairs 3 months and 2 days. Footnote: Petronius differs hardly 3 days from Josephus, and says Otho perished on the 95th day of his reign. End footnote. Otho's army also came over to Vitellius's generals, and he came himself down to Rome with his army. But in the meantime Vespasian removed from Caesarea, on the 5th day of the month Diasius, Sivan, and marched against those places of Judea which were not yet overthrown. So he went up to the mountainous country, and took those 2 toparchies that were called the Gophnitic and Acrabatine toparchies, after he took Bethel and Ephraim, 2 small cities, and when he had put garrisons into them, he rode as far as Jerusalem, in which march he took many prisoners and many captives. But Cerelius, one of his commanders, took a body of horsemen and footmen, and laid waste to that part of Idumea which was called the Upper Idumea, and attacked Caphethra, which pretended to be a small city, and took it at the first onset, and burnt it down. He also attacked Caphetabira, and laid siege to it, for it had a very strong wall, and when he expected to spend a long time in that siege, those that were within opened their gates on the sudden, and came to beg pardon, and surrendered themselves up to him. When Cerelius had conquered them, he went to Hebron, another very ancient city. I have told you already that this city is situated in the mountainous country not far off Jerusalem. And when he had broken into the city by force, what multitude and young men were left therein he slew, and burnt down the city. So that as now all the places were taken, excepting Herodium and Mazda, and Machaerus, which were in the possession of the robbers, so Jerusalem was what the Romans at present aimed at. 10. And now, as soon as Simon had set his wife free, and recovered her from the zealots, he returned back to the remainders of Idumea, and driving the nation all before him from all quarters, he compelled a large number of them to retire to Jerusalem. He followed them himself also to the city, and encompassed the wall all round again. And when he lighted upon any laborers that were coming thither out of the country, he slew them. Now this Simon, who was without the wall, was a greater terror to the people than the Romans themselves, as were the zealots, who were within it, more heavy upon them than both of the other. And during this time did the mischievous contrivances and courage of John corrupt the body of the Galileans. For these Galileans had advanced this John, and made him very potent, who made them suitable requital from the authority he had obtained by their means, for he permitted them to do all things that any of them desired to do, while their inclination to plunder was insatiable, as was their zeal in searching the houses of the rich, and for the murdering of the men, and abusing of the women, it was sport to them. They also devoured what spoils they had taken, together with their blood, and indulged themselves in feminine wantonness, without any disturbance, till they were satiated therein, while they decked their hair and put on women's garments, and were besmeared over with ointments, and that they might appear very comely, they had paints under their eyes, and imitated not only the ornaments, but also the lusts of women, and were guilty of such intolerable uncleanness that they invented unlawful pleasures of that sort. And thus did they roll themselves up and down the city, as in a brothel house, and defiled it entirely with their impure actions. Nay, while their faces looked like the faces of women, they killed with their right hands, and when their gait was effeminate, they presently attacked men, and became warriors, and drew their swords from under their finely dyed cloaks, and ran every body through whom they alighted upon. However, Simon waited for such as ran away from John, and was the more bloody of the two, and he who had escaped the tyrant within the wall was destroyed by the other that lay before the gates, so that all attempts of flying and deserting to the Romans were cut off, as to those that had a mind so to do. 11. Yet did the army that was under John raise a sedition against him, and all the Idumeans separated themselves from the tyrant, and attempted to destroy him, and this out of their envy at his power, and hatred of his cruelty. So they got together, and slew many of the zealots, and drove the rest before them into that royal palace that was built by Grapte, who was a relation of Azates, the king of Adiabene. The Idumeans fell in with them, and drove the zealots out thence into the temple, and betook themselves to plunder John's effects. For both he himself was in that palace, and therein had he laid up the spoils he had acquired by his tyranny. In the meantime, the multitude of those zealots that were dispersed over the city ran together to the temple unto those that fled thither, and John prepared to bring them down against the people and the Idumeans, who were not so much afraid of being attacked by them, because they were themselves better soldiers than they, as at their madness, lest they should privately sally out of the temple and get among them, and not only destroy them, but set the city on fire also. So they assembled themselves together, and the high priests with them, and took counsel after what manner they should avoid their assault. Now it was God who turned their opinions to the worst advice, and thence they devised such a remedy to get themselves free as was worse than the disease itself. Accordingly, in order to overthrow John, they determined to admit Simon, and earnestly to desire the introduction of a second tyrant into the city, which resolution they brought to perfection, and sent Matthias, the high priest, to beseech this Simon to come ill to them, of whom they had so often been afraid. Those also that had fled from the zealots in Jerusalem joined in this request to him, out of the desire they had of preserving their houses and their effects. Accordingly he, in an arrogant manner, granted them his lordly protection, and came into the city, in order to deliver it from the zealots. The people also made joyful acclamations to him, as their Savior and their Preserver. But when he was come in with his army, he took care to secure his own authority, and looked upon those that had invited him in to be no less his enemies than those against whom the invitation was intended. 12. And thus did Simon get possession of Jerusalem, in the 3rd year of the war, in the month Xanthicus, Nisan. Whereupon John, with his multitude of zealots, as being both prohibited from coming out of the temple, and having lost their power in the city, for Simon and his party had plundered them of what they had, were in despair of deliverance. Simon also made an assault upon the temple, with the assistance of the people, while the others stood upon the cloisters and the battlements, and defended themselves from their assaults. However, a considerable number of Simon's party fell, and many were carried off wounded, for the zealots threw their darts easily from a superior place, and seldom failed of hitting their enemies. But having the advantage of situation, and having withal erected 4 very large towers aforehand, that their darts might come from higher places, one at the northeast corner of the court, one above the Xystus, the third at another corner over against the lower city, and the last was erected above the top of the Pastaphoria, where one of the priests stood of course, and gave a signal beforehand, with a trumpet at the beginning of every 7th day, in the evening twilight, as also at the evening when that day was finished, as giving notice to the people when they were to leave off work, and when they were to go to work again. Footnote: This beginning and ending of the observation of the Jewish 7th day, or Sabbath, with a priest's blowing of a trumpet, is remarkable, and nowhere else mentioned that I know of. Nor is Rieland's conjecture here improbable, that this was the very place that has puzzled our commentators so long, called Musak Sabbati, the covert of the Sabbath, if that be the true reading, 2 Kings 16:18, because here the proper priest stood dry, under a covering, to proclaim the beginning and ending of every Jewish Sabbath. End footnote. These men also set their engines to cast darts and stones withal, upon those towers, with their archers and slingers. And now Simon made his assault upon the temple more faintly, by reason that the greatest part of his men grew weary of that work, yet did he not leave off his opposition, because his army was superior to the others, although the darts which were thrown by the engines were carried a great way, and slew many of those that fought for him. End of Book 4, Chapter 9.
Book 4, Chapter 10 of the Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Hollis Hanover. The Wars of the Jews by Josephus, translated by William Whiston. Chapter 10. How the soldiers, both in Judea and in Egypt, proclaimed Vespasian emperor, and how Vespasian released Josephus from his bonds. 1. Now about this very time it was that heavy calamities came about Rome on all sides. For Vitellius was come from Germany with his soldiery, and drew along with him a great multitude of other men besides. And when the spaces allotted for soldiers could not contain them, he made all Rome itself his camp, and filled all the houses with his armed men, which men, when they saw the riches of Rome with those eyes which had never seen such riches before, and found themselves shown round about on all sides with silver and gold, they had much ado to contain their covetous desires, and were ready to betake themselves to plunder, and to the slaughter of such as should stand in their way. And this was the state of affairs in Italy at that time. 2. But when Vespasian had overthrown all the places that were near to Jerusalem, he returned to Caesarea, and heard of the troubles that were at Rome, and that Vitellius was emperor. This produced indignation in him, although he well knew how to be governed as well as to govern, and could not, with any satisfaction, own him for his lord, who acted so madly, and seized upon the government as if it were absolutely destitute of a governor. And as this sorrow of his was violent, he was not able to support the torments he was under, nor to apply himself further in other wars, when his native country was laid waste. But then, as much as his passion excited him to avenge his country, so much was he restrained by the consideration of his distance therefrom, because fortune might prevent him, and do a world of mischief before he could himself sail over the sea to Italy, especially as it was still the winter season. So he restrained his anger, how vehement soever it was at the time. But now his commanders and soldiers met in several companies, and consulted openly about changing the public affairs, and, out of their indignation, cried out how, at Rome there are soldiers that live delicately, and when they have not ventured so much as to hear the fame of war, they ordain whom they please for our governors, and in hopes of gain make them emperors, while you, who have gone through so many labors, and are grown into years under your helmets, give leave to others to use such a power, when yet you have among yourselves one more worthy to rule than any whom they have set up. Now what juster opportunity shall they ever have of requiting their generals, if they do not make use of this that is now before them? While there is so much juster reasons for Vespasian's being emperor than for Vitellius, as they are themselves more deserving than those that made the other emperors, for that they have undergone as great wars as have the troops that came from Germany, nor are they inferior in war to those that have brought that tyrant to Rome, nor have they undergone smaller labors than they, for that neither will the Roman Senate nor people bear such a lascivious emperor as Vitellius, if he be compared with their chaste Vespasian. Nor will they endure a most barbarous tyrant instead of a good governor, nor choose one that hath no child to preside over them, instead of him that is a father, because the advancement of men's own children to dignities is certainly the greatest security kings can have for themselves. Footnote: the Roman authors that now remain say Vitellius had children, whereas Josephus introduces here the Roman soldiers in Judea, saying he had none. Which of these assertions was the truth I know not. Spanheim thinks he hath given a peculiar reason for calling Vitellius childless, though he really had children, to which it appears very difficult to give our assent. End footnote. Whether, therefore, we estimate the capacity of governing from the skill of a person in years, we ought to have Vespasian, or whether from the strength of a young man, we ought to have Titus. For by this means we shall have the advantage of both their ages, for that they will afford strength to those that shall be made emperors, they having already 3 legions, besides other auxiliaries from neighboring kings, and will have further all the armies in the east to support them, as also those in Europe. So they are as they are out of the distance and dread of Vitellius, besides such auxiliaries as they may have in Italy itself, that is, Vespasian's brother. Footnote: this brother of Vespasian was Flavius Sabinus, as Suetonius informs us. He is also named by Josephus presently, chapter 11, section 4. End footnote. And his other son, Domitian, the one of whom will bring in a great many of those young men that are of dignity, while the other is entrusted with the government of the city, which office of his will be no small means of Vespasian's obtaining the government. Upon the whole, the case may be such, that if we ourselves make further delays, the Senate may choose an emperor whom the soldiers, who are the saviors of the empire, will have in contempt. 4. These were the discourses the soldiers had in their several companies, after which they got together in a great body, and, encouraging one another, they declared Vespasian emperor, and exhorted him to save the government, which was now in danger. Footnote: it is plain by the nature of the thing, as well as by Josephus and Eutropius, that Vespasian was first of all saluted emperor in Judea, and not till some time afterward in Egypt. Whence Tacitus's and Suetonius's present copies must be correct texts, when they both say that he was first proclaimed in Egypt, and that on the calends of July, while they still say it was the 5th of the nones, or ides of the same July, before he was proclaimed in Judea. I suppose the month they there intended was June, and not July, as the copies now have it. Nor does Tacitus's coherence imply less. End footnote. Now Vespasian's concern had been for a considerable time about the public. Yet did he not intend to set up for governor himself, though his actions showed him to deserve it, while he preferred that safety which is in a private life before the dangers in a state of such dignity. But when he refused the empire, the commanders insisted the more earnestly upon his acceptance, and the soldiers came about him with their drawn swords in their hands, and threatened to kill him, unless he would now live according to his dignity. And when he had shown his reluctance a great while, and had endeavored to thrust away this dominion from him, he at length, being not able to persuade them, yielded to their solicitations that would salute him emperor. 5. So upon the exhortations of Mucianus and the other commanders that he would accept of the empire, and upon that of the rest of the army, who cried out that they were willing to be led against all his opposers, he was in the first place intent upon gaining the dominion over Alexandria, as knowing that Egypt was of the greatest consequence, in order to obtain the entire government, because of its supplying of corn to Rome; which corn, if he could be master of, he hoped to dethrone Vitellius, supposing he should aim to keep the empire by force, for he would not be able to support himself if the multitude at Rome should once be in want of food. And because he was desirous to join the 2 legions that were at Alexandria to the other legions that were with him, he also considered with himself that he should then have that country for a defense to himself against the uncertainty of fortune. For Egypt is hard to be entered by land, and hath no good havens by sea. Footnote. Here we have an authentic description of the bounds and circumstances of Egypt in the days of Vespasian and Titus. End footnote. It hath on the west the dry deserts of Libya, and on the south Seine, that divides it from Ethiopia, as well as the cataracts of the Nile, that cannot be sailed over. And on the east the Red Sea extended as far as Coptus, and it is fortified on the north by the land that reaches to Syria, together with that called the Egyptian Sea, having no havens in it for ships. And thus is Egypt walled about on every side. Its length between Pelusium and Seine is 2,000 furlongs, and the passage by sea from Plinthine to Pelusium is 3,600 furlongs. Its river Nile is navigable as far as the city called Elephantine, the forenamed cataracts hindering ships from going any farther. The haven also of Alexandria is not entered by the mariners without difficulty, even in times of peace. For the passage inward is narrow, and full of rocks that lie under the water, which oblige the mariners to turn from a straight direction. Its left side is blocked up by works made by men's hands on both sides. On its right side lies the island called Pharos, which is situated just before the entrance, and supports a very great tower that affords the sight of a fire to such as sail within 300 furlongs of it, that ships may cast anchor a great way off in the night time, by reason of the difficulty of sailing nearer. About this island are built very great piers, the handiwork of men, against which, when the sea dashes itself and its waves are broken against these boundaries, the navigation becomes very troublesome, and the entrance through so narrow a passage is rendered dangerous. Yet it is the haven itself, when you are got into it, a very safe one, and of 30 furlongs in largeness, into which is brought what the country wants in order to its happiness, and also what abundance the country affords more than it wants itself is hence distributed into all the habitable earth. 6. Justly, therefore, did Vespasian desire to obtain that government, in order to corroborate his attempts upon the whole empire. So he immediately sent to Tiberius Alexander, who was then governor of Egypt and of Alexandria, and informed him what the army had put upon him, and how he, being forced to accept the burden of the government, was desirous to have him for his confederate and supporter. Now, as soon as ever Alexander had read this letter, he readily obliged the legions and the multitude to take the oath of fidelity to Vespasian, both which willingly complied with him, as already acquainted with the courage of the man, from that his conduct in their neighborhood. Accordingly Vespasian, looking upon himself as already entrusted with the government, got all things ready for his journey to Rome. Now fame carried this news abroad more suddenly than one could have thought, that he was emperor over the East, upon which every city kept festivals, and celebrated sacrifices and oblations for such good news. The legions also that were in Mysia and Pannonia, who had been in commotion a little before, on account of this insolent attempt of Vitellius, were very glad to take the oath of fidelity to Vespasian, upon his coming to the empire. Vespasian then removed from Caesarea to Berytus, where many embassages came to him from Syria, and many from other provinces, bringing with them from every city crowns and the congratulations of the people. Mucianus came also, who was the president of the province, and told him with what alacrity the people received the news of his advancement, and how the people of every city had taken the oath of fidelity to him. 7. So Vespasian's good fortune succeeded to his wishes everywhere, and the public affairs were, for the greatest part, already in his hands, upon which he considered that he had not arrived at the government without divine providence, but that a righteous kind of fate had brought the empire under his power. For as he called to mind the other signals, which had been a great many everywhere, that foretold he should obtain the government, so did he remember what Josephus had said to him when he ventured to foretell his coming to the empire while Nero was alive. So he was much concerned that this man was still in bonds with him. He then called for Mucianus, together with his other commanders and friends, and in the first place he informed them what a valiant man Josephus had been, and what great hardships he had made him undergo in the siege of Jotapata. After that he related those predictions of his which he had then suspected as fictions, suggested out of the fear that he was in, but which had by time been demonstrated to be divine. Footnote: As Daniel was preferred by Darius and Cyrus on account of his having foretold the destruction of the Babylonian monarchy by their means, and the consequent exultation of the Medes and Persians, Daniel 5:6, or rather, as Jeremiah, when he was a prisoner, was set at liberty and honorably treated by Nebzaradan at the command of Nebuchadnezzar, on account of his having foretold the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, Jeremiah 40:1-7, so was our Josephus set at liberty and honorably treated on account of his having foretold the advancement of Vespasian and Titus to the Roman Empire. All these are most eminent instances of the interposition of divine providence and of the certainty of divine predictions in the great revolutions of the four monarchies. Several such like examples there are, both in the sacred and other histories, as in the case of Joseph in Egypt, and of Jadua the high priest in the days of Alexander the Great, etc. End footnote. It is a shameful thing, said he, that this man, who hath foretold my coming to the empire beforehand, and been the minister of a divine message to me, should still be retained in the condition of a captive or prisoner. So he called for Josephus, and commanded that he should be set at liberty. Whereupon the commanders promised themselves glorious things, froth this requital Vespasian made to a stranger. Titus was then present with his father, and said, O father, it is but just that the scandal of a prisoner should be taken off Josephus, together with his iron chain. For if we do not barely loose his bonds, but cut them to pieces, he will be like a man that had never been bound at all. For that is the usual method as to such as have been bound without a cause. This advice was agreed to by Vespasian also. So there came a man in, and cut the chain to pieces, while Josephus received this testimony of his integrity for a reward, and was moreover esteemed a person of credit as to futurities also. End of Book 4, Chapter 10. Recording by Hollis, Hanover.
Book 4, Chapter 11 of the Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. The Wars of the Jews by Josephus, translated by William Whiston. Chapter 11. That upon the conquest and slaughter of Vitellius, Vespasian hastened his journey to Rome, but Titus his son returned to Jerusalem. 1. And now, when Vespasian had given answers to the embassages, and had disposed of the places of power justly, and according to every one's deserts, he came to Antioch, and consulting which way he had best take, he preferred to go for Rome, rather than to march to Alexandria, because he saw that Alexandria was sure to him already, but that the affairs at Rome were put into disorder by Vitellius. So he sent Mucianus to Italy, and committed a considerable army both of horsemen and footmen to him. Yet was Mucianus afraid of going by sea, because it was the middle of winter, and so he led his army on foot through Cappadocia and Phrygia. Footnote: This is well observed by Josephus, that Vespasian, in order to secure his success and establish his government at first, distributed his offices and places upon the foot of justice, and bestowed them on such as best deserved them, and were best fit for them. Which wise conduct in a mere heathen ought to put those rulers and ministers of state to shame, who, professing Christianity, act otherwise, and thereby expose themselves and their kingdoms to vice and destruction. End footnote. 2. In the meantime, Antonius Primus took the third of the legions that were in Mysia, for he was president of that province, and made haste, in order to fight Vitellius. Whereupon Vitellius sent away Caecina with a great army, having a mighty confidence in him, because of his having beaten Otho. This Caecina marched out of Rome in great haste, and found Antonius about Cremona in Gaul, which city is in the borders of Italy. But when he saw there that the enemy were numerous and in good order, he durst not fight them, and as he thought of retreat dangerous, so he began to think of betraying his army to Antonius. Accordingly, he assembled the centurions and tribunes that were under his command, and persuaded them to go over to Antonius, and this by diminishing the reputation of Vitellius, and by exaggerating the power of Vespasian. He also told them that with the one there was no more than the bare name of dominion, but with the other was the power of it, and that it was better for them to prevent necessity, and gain favor, and while they were likely to be overcome in battle, to avoid the danger beforehand, and go over to Antonius willingly, that Vespasian was able of himself to subdue what had not yet submitted under their assistance, while Vitellius could not preserve what he had already with it. 3. Caecina said this, and much more to the same purpose, and persuaded them to comply with him, and both he and his army deserted. But still the very same night the soldiers repented of what they had done, and a fear seized on them, lest perhaps Vitellius who sent them should get the better, and drawing their swords, they assaulted Caecina, in order to kill him, and the thing had been done by them, if the tribunes had not fallen upon their knees, and besought them not to do it. So the soldiers did not kill him, but put him in bonds as a traitor, and were about to send him to Vitellius. When Antonius Primus heard of this, he raised up his men immediately, and made them put on their armor, and led them against those that had revolted. Hereupon they put themselves in order of battle, and made a resistance for a while, but were soon beaten, and fled to Cremona. Then did Primus take his horsemen, and cut off their entrance into the city, and encompassed and destroyed a great multitude of them before the city, and fell into the city together with the rest, and gave leave to his soldiers to plunder it. And here it was that many strangers, who were merchants, as well as many of the people of that country, perished, and among them Vitellius's whole army, being 30,200, while Antonius lost no more of those than came with him from Mysia than 4,500. He then loosed Caecina, and sent him to Vespasian to tell him the good news. So he came, and was received by him, and covered the scandal of his treachery by the unexpected honors he received from Vespasian. 4. And now, upon the news that Antonius was approaching, Sabinus took courage at Rome, and assembled those cohorts of soldiers that kept watch by night, and in the night time seized upon the capital. And as the day came on, many men of character came over to him, with Domitian his brother's son, whose encouragement was of very great weight for the compassing the government. Now Vitellius was not much concerned at this Primus, but was very angry with those that had revolted with Sabinus, and thirsting, out of his own natural barbarity, after noble blood, he sent out that part of the army which came along with him to fight against the capital. And many bold actions were done on this side, and on the side of those that held the temple. But at last the soldiers that came from Germany, being too numerous for the others, got the hill into their possession, where Domitian, with many other of the principal Romans, providentially escaped, while the rest of the multitude were entirely cut to pieces, and Sabinus himself was brought to Vitellius, and then slain. The soldiers also plundered the temple of its ornaments and set it on fire. But now within a day's time came Antonius with his army, and were met by Vitellius and his army, and having had a battle in 3 several places, the last were all destroyed. Then did Vitellius come out of the palace, in his cups, and satiated with an extravagant and luxurious meal, as in the last extremity, and being drawn along through the multitude, and abused with all sorts of torments, had his head cut off in the midst of Rome, having retained the government 8 months and 5 days, and had he lived much longer, I cannot but think the empire would not have been sufficient for his lust. Footnote: the numbers in Josephus for Galba, 7 months 7 days, for Otho 3 months 2 days, and here for Vitellius 8 months 5 days, do not agree with any Roman historians, who also disagree among themselves. And indeed, Seeliger justly complains, as Dr. Hudson observes, that this period is very confused and uncertain in the ancient authors. They were probably some of them contemporary together for some time. One of the best evidences we have, I mean Ptolemy's Canon, omits them all, as if they did not all together reign one whole year, nor had a single Thoth, or New Year's Day, which then fell upon August 6th, in their entire reigns. Dio also, who says that Vitellius reigned a year within 10 days, does yet estimate all their reigns together at no more than 1 year, 1 month, and 2 days. Of the others that were slain were numbered above 50,000. This battle was fought on the 3rd day of the month Epileus (Casleu). On the next day Mucianus came into the city with his army, and ordered Antonius and his men to leave off killing, for they were still searching the houses, and killed many of Vitellius's soldiers, and many of the populace, as supposing them to be of his party, preventing by their rage any accurate distinction between them and others. He then produced Domitian, and recommended him to the multitude, until his father should come himself. So the people being now freed from their fears, made acclamations of joy for Vespasian, as for their emperor, and kept festival days for his confirmation, and for the destruction of Vitellius. 5. And now, as Vespasian came to Alexandria, this good news came from Rome, and at the same time came embassies from all his own habitable earth, to congratulate him upon his advancement. And though this Alexandria was the greatest of all cities next to Rome, it proved too narrow to contain the multitude that then came into it. So upon this confirmation of Vespasian's entire government, which was now settled, and upon the unexpected deliverance of the public affairs of the Romans from ruin, Vespasian turned his thoughts to what remained unsubdued in Judea. However, he himself made haste to go to Rome, as the winter was now almost over, and soon set the affairs of Alexandria in order, but sent his son Titus with a select part of his army to destroy Jerusalem. So Titus marched on foot as far as Nicopolis, which is distant 20 furlongs from Alexandria. There he put his army on board some long ships, and sailed upon the river along the Mendesian Nomus, as far as the city Tumuius. There he got out of the ships, and walked on foot, and lodged all night at a small city, called Tanis. His second station was Heracleopolis, and his third Pelusium. He then refreshed his army at that place for 2 days, and on the third passed over the mouths of the Nile at Pelusium. He then proceeded 1 station over the desert, and pitched his camp at the temple of Casian Jupiter. There are coins of this Casian Jupiter still extant. And on the next day at Ostracine. This station had no water, but the people of the country made use of water brought from other places. After this he rested at Rhinocolura, and from thence he went to Raphia, which was his 4th station. This city is the beginning of Syria. For his 5th station he pitched his camp at Gaza, after which he came to Ascalon, and thence to Jamnia, and after that to Joppa, and from Joppa to Caesarea, having taken a resolution to gather all his other forces together at that place. End of Book 4, Chapter 11. End of Book 4.